Hi guys, and welcome to our little philosophy videos. So today we are going through St. Thomas Aquinas. You should have already watched the little video documentary about his life, so I'm just going to kind of speed through the first couple slides of this PowerPoint since all that information was already covered in that video. Additionally, we did talk about these things before we got out for Corona and tornado and spring break and all the crazy, so I'm not going to take the time to go over them again. I will post this completed PowerPoint on Schoology once we get through it. We are going to be dealing with some kind of heavy concepts that are a little confusing, so I'm going to try and go slow for us. And again, you can pause the videos if you need to write something down or type something. I'm not going to sit here quietly and wait for you to finish recording something, okay? So, also, gonna apologize in advance for the computer lag. Recording and doing PowerPoint on my computer seems to kind of like anger the beast. So if it seems laggy and not everything's popping up, really sorry, we'll just kind of bear with it, all right? So, our objectives, again, we are listing arguments of early Christian philosophers and their contribution to monotheistic theology. We're also going to be able to list different philosophers of the Middle Ages and Renaissance and outline main ideas. So for objective 10, we already did some of that with Boethius and Anselm and Augustine. We are just going to add Thomas to this mix, and then probably Thomas will take up a week or two, and then we'll maybe just finish up on a couple like overview of Renaissance philosophers. All right, so again, you already know who Thomas is. You know he's a Dominican. You know he's from the medieval university. We roughly will go over his task. So he's going to be tasked with kind of incorporating Aristotle into Christian theology and the way they deal with things. So you know that Aristotle and his works fell out of favor because he was a pagan, and you can't have a pagan in the church. So once Aquinas receives his degree and Aristotle has been rising in popularity, they're going to want to incorporate that into theology, okay? So that was your do now. So Thomas is going to approach this task in a couple of ways. Namely, he is a scholastic, so a couple things we're going to keep in mind with that is that he's going to start from the truth. But he's always going to start from the truth with the Christian doctrine, and he is going to use that to support it. Okay. He is a monk, he is Christian, and part of his task is to further ideas of Christianity and lay them out in a almost empirical / scientific way. All right. So the use of analysis and logic, as well as references. So he is basically going to write like a research essay or a persuasive essay to kind of convince people of his ideas. All right. He is going to present his argument, and then he's going to argue for it. And we're going to take a look at some of his arguments, okay? And then he is going to use his evidence, concrete experience, deductive reasoning, and natural reasoning to further his ideas. And namely, the big ones we're going to be looking at is he is going to argue for the existence of God. So with Christianity on the scene, there are still some naysayers out there, right, or different religions. And so he is going to argue that God does exist, and here is how, and let me show you. And these are the methods he's going to be using. So we're going to have persuasive writing, we're going to have arguments that we argue for, we're going to try and use evidence and natural and deductive reasoning. Okay, so we have talked about natural reasoning before. We mentioned it and looked at it when we talked about Aristotle, but it has been a while since we did anything with Aristotle. So in this way, natural reason is going to be related to this world, right? It's not messy, it's neat, it's very concise, and it is unaided by divine revelation. So a lot of what's happening during the Middle Ages is you have philosophers, you have church doctors, you have members of the church who are saying, I saw a saint in a dream who told me that this is what it's supposed to be and that God does exist because he spoke to me in a dream, or I saw this, or I saw a sign, XYZ. So Thomas is going to try and prove the existence of God without using any divine reason or revelation. He's not going to say, well, I saw in a dream this, which clearly means that God is real. He's going to try and use kind of like a science and a logic to prove this. Okay. So, like I just said, his efforts to prove God's existence are going to begin with evidence, and then he's going to use this natural reason. Remember, clear, precise, to further prove this. So his arguments exist in something called the 5 ways. So essentially, he says there are 5 ways that I can prove the existence of God. Okay. And I think what I'm going to do is we'll just look at maybe one of them individually, at like one at a time. If it seems smaller, maybe we'll do 2. We'll see how this plays out, because I do really want you to understand these 5 reasons. They seem complex, but most of these reasons and the way you reason are things you already do. You just didn't realize it. Okay. All right. So 5 ways of proving the existence of God. So, before we get into his 5 reasons, Thomas's arguments begin with scientific observations. So, like, he notices, like, I see that the sun is shining and that it has warmth. This is a very blanket general statement, okay? And then he's going to attempt to show that only logically explanations for them requires the existence of God. So he's going to... It will make sense once we look at it, but basically what it comes down to is he notices something scientifically, he's going to bring it up, and basically through process of elimination, he is going to prove the existence of God. So it's going to be like, the only way this could actually happen is if there is some higher being, okay? So, and then we have to be careful, because if there are other plausible arguments that we can use and that can account for these observations, then Thomas has not conclusively proved the existence of God. He's only shown that God is possible, or God's existence is possible. Okay, so he has to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that God exists. If you can come up with another argument that argues against what he is stating, then all he has done is shown that it is possible, not that it is true. If that makes sense, we're good. Okay. So again, if you have questions about this, you can post comments or on the discussion board, or stop in during office hours if you want to discuss further. Okay. So our first way is going to be called the way of motion. All right. So the argument is technically titled the argument from motion, which basically says, in order to avoid an infinite regress, as in infinite motion, there must be an unmoved mover capable of imparting motion to all other things. Okay. And so by motion, he means both like linear moving, like you're moving down a line, or you're going from point A to B, but also life motion, like growing up or getting, birth or death. All of those things fall under this idea of motion. Okay, so basically, argument for motion is you have to have the unmoved mover, something that kicks it all off. Otherwise, like, how do things begin moving to begin with, and why do they continue moving? Okay, so for example, let's say you're playing pool. Okay, the ball, like, you have your white cue ball and then you have all your other balls. The balls are set in motion after being hit by the cue ball, and the cue ball is already moving. Okay, so the only way those balls move is if it is hit by something that is already moving. Okay, and then the cue ball doesn't move until it is hit by something that is already moving. In this case, the pool stick or the cue stick. Okay, so basically the stick is moving, and because the stick is moving and it hits the white ball, then the white ball begins moving, right? But it can't just start moving on its own. Something already moving has to hit it. And now that it's been hit, it can hit other things and make those things move. But if we go all the way back, the cue stick is already moving because something is moving it, right? So the cue stick just doesn't get up by itself, smack the cue ball, and then the cue ball doesn't just magically move and smack all the balls. Something has to start it, right? And in that instance, the unmoved mover, and in our pool example, the unmoved mover is me, because I'm the one who starts this movement. The unmoved mover has to start this. If there is no unmoved mover, nothing will actually happen. And then he also takes this example into life. So like I'm given life by my parents who are already moving or alive in this instance, who had to be given life by their already living parents and so on. So you can't have life out of nothing. Like Boomer isn't just going to sprout out of the ground. It doesn't work that way. He had to come from some dogs that were already living. He's looking at me like I'm crazy, which is accurate. Right? So in Thomas's words precisely, he says, therefore, whatever is moved must be moved by another. If that by which it is moved be itself moved, then this is also must needs be moved by another, and that by another again. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover, and consequently no other mover, seeing that subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they are moved by the first mover, as the staff moves only because it is moved by the hand. Therefore, it is necessary to arrive at a first mover, moved by no other, and this everyone understands to be God. Okay, so if we break it down and we look back at our pool example, something has to be moved. Everything is moved by something, but we have to come to the first mover, the unmoved mover, so to speak, who cannot be moved, has not been moved, and as a result will move other things. And he says, we understand that to be God, because eventually we run out of things like, well, what makes humans move? Where did we come from? And then that's where you can get into the text like, well, Adam and Eve, well, where did they move from? And then you're like, oh, well, the unmoved mover was God. He was the one who set that into motion. Okay. So the conclusion is that God is the unmoved mover, and he exists outside of this chain of movement. Okay. And so, it's a constant chain. Like you set things into motion, and then that moves something, and then that moves something. But because God is this unmoved mover, he is out of this chain, right? He's the one who starts all of it. Sorry, I'm just trying to see what comes up next, because I think, okay, yeah. So, that kind of goes through the first of Thomas's arguments. And I just want to let you know, I do, for the intents of this lesson, am referring to God in like the traditional like Catholic sense as he, okay? I know there are lots of different debates about this, but I am just following along with Thomas's arguments and beliefs, all right? So, I hope all of this makes sense on a level. There will be kind of like a discussion question based on this, or like an assessment thing for you guys to complete. So if you have questions, you can post them there. You can also watch this video a couple times. It takes a couple times to break down, but once you get this idea of there being a chain, that nothing moves without somebody else moving it, and there has to be a starting point for this movement, and it's God, I think this is relatively a straightforward argument, all right? And so our query here is going to be, is there any explanation for motion besides the unmoved mover? So if so, what is it? And if not, is Thomas's conclusion sound? So are there other things that exist that could possibly cause motion that is not this idea of an unmoved mover? Keep in mind, we are during the Middle Ages, so science isn't quite what it used to be, but can we still apply this idea today? Or are there other explanations? Do Thomas's arguments and does his conclusion sound reasonable? Like it's sound. There's no fallacies or mistakes in this, all right? So I will post these questions for you on Schoology, and then tomorrow we will look at argument 2, okay? So remember, our first argument is going to be the argument from motion, all right? I will leave you guys here, and I won't see you tomorrow, but you will hear me tomorrow. So have a great rest of your day, guys.